The morning sun cast long shadows across Government House as Margaret Whitmore arranged her papers with practiced precision. The heavy oak desk bore the weight of the empire's bureaucracy. Leather-bound ledgers, brass inkwells, and stacks of correspondence awaiting the governor's attention. She smoothed her dark wool skirt and adjusted the high collar that concealed the birthmark spanning her throat, a wine-dark stain that had marked her as different since childhood. Governor Edmund Harwick entered with military bearing, his polished boots echoing against the marble floor. The morning assembly would begin in precisely 30 minutes, and the colony's administrators expected their orders transcribed without error. Margaret dipped her pen and waited for his dictation, her fingers steady despite the familiar weight of scrutiny from the other clerks who questioned why a woman, and one so obviously flawed, held such a position of trust. "Take this down, Miss Whitmore," Harwick began, his voice carrying the authority of 20 years in colonial service. "To all district commissioners, recent intelligence suggests increased unrest among the native population. All trading permits are hereby suspended pending review. Signed, Edmund Harwick, Governor of the Protectorate." Margaret's pen moved across the parchment in careful strokes, but as she wrote the final words, additional text seemed to flow from her nib. "The old agreements shall be honored. The blood price stands." She stared at the unauthorized words, her hand trembling. She had written nothing beyond Harwick's dictation, yet the ink was fresh and unmistakably hers. "Is there difficulty, Miss Whitmore?" Harwick's gray eyes narrowed as he noticed her hesitation. "No, sir. The document is complete." She blotted the excess ink, hoping the governor would not examine her work too closely. But Chief Administrator Blackwood, a man whose ambition exceeded his loyalty, had already moved closer to inspect the transcription. "Governor, if I may," Blackwood's thin fingers traced the unauthorized text. "It appears your secretary has taken liberties with your dictation." The room fell silent. Margaret felt the eyes of every clerk and administrator upon her, their whispered doubts about her competence now seemingly confirmed. The birthmark at her throat seemed to burn under their collective gaze. "Explain this immediately," Harwick demanded, his voice cold as winter stone. Margaret's mind raced. To claim the words appeared without her knowledge would sound like madness. To admit deliberate alteration would mean dismissal, or worse. In the colonial territories, accusations of sedition carried severe consequences. She began, then noticed something curious about the unauthorized text. The ink appeared darker where the additional words were written, as if drawn from a different well. She glanced at her workspace and realized her primary inkwell remained at the same level as when she had begun writing. "Sir, I believe there may have been contamination in the ink. Perhaps residue from previous documents." It was a desperate gambit, but she had observed enough of the governor's methodical nature to know he would investigate rather than condemn without evidence. Harwick examined the document carefully, then the inkwell, his expression unreadable. "Miss Whitmore will remain after the morning assembly," he announced. "We shall resolve this matter thoroughly." The dismissal was clear, and the other staff filed out with barely concealed excitement at witnessing her potential downfall. Alone with Harwick, Margaret felt the full weight of her precarious position. The governor moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he studied the bustling courtyard below. Native merchants, British traders, and colonial officials moved in the careful choreography of imperial commerce, each group maintaining the prescribed distances that preserved order. 23 years I have served the crown in various capacities," Harwick said without turning. "I have seen clerks forge documents for gold, for revenge, for causes they believed righteous. What I have not seen is mysterious text appearing of its own accord. Sir, I swear upon my honor that I wrote only what you dictated." Harwick faced her then, his expression grave. "Your honor, Miss Whitmore, is a luxury you cannot afford. You are here because your skills exceed your station, and your station exists only because I permit it. The birthmark that marks you as different also makes you conspicuous. Should suspicion fall upon this office, you will be the first sacrifice offered to preserve colonial stability." The bluntness of his words struck her like a physical blow. She had always known her position was tenuous, but hearing it stated so plainly reminded her how completely she depended upon his protection. However, Harwick continued, moving to a locked cabinet behind his desk, I am not a man who discards useful tools without proper investigation. He produced a key and opened the cabinet, revealing stacks of documents bound in red ribbon. These are the original colonial charters, Miss Whitmore, the true founding documents of this protectorate. Since you claim no knowledge of how those words appeared on today's correspondence, perhaps you can explain why identical phrases appear in texts written 50 years before your birth. Margaret stared at the ancient parchment he placed before her. The handwriting was different, the paper yellowed with age, but there in the margin was the exact text that had appeared under her pen. The old agreements shall be honored. The blood price stands. This presents us with an interesting dilemma, Harwick said, settling into his chair. Either you are remarkably well read in obscure colonial documents, or something else entirely is occurring. Either possibility makes you dangerous, Miss Whitmore. The question becomes whether you are more dangerous as an ally or an enemy. Margaret studied the governor's face, searching for some hint of his intentions. The morning light revealed new lines around his eyes, the burden of command etched in flesh. She had transcribed enough confidential correspondence to know the mounting pressures he faced. London's demands for increased revenue, growing unrest among the native population, and whispers from other colonies about challenges to British authority. What would you have me do, sir? Continue your duties exactly as before. Transcribe precisely what is dictated, but should any additional text appear, he paused, considering his words carefully. Should such incidents occur, you will report them immediately to me alone, not to Blackwood, not to the other administrators, not to anyone. The penalty for disclosure will be severe, Miss Whitmore. The rewards for loyalty, however, may prove substantial. The implicit threat was clear, but Margaret also detected something else in his tone: uncertainty. The governor of one of Britain's most profitable protectorates was troubled by mysterious text appearing in official documents, and he needed her cooperation to understand what was happening. I understand, sir. See that you do. The morning assembly will proceed with the original order, trading permits suspended. The document with additional text will be filed separately. Harwick locked the ancient charter away and moved toward the door. Miss Whitmore, your discretion in this matter will determine whether your position here continues. Choose wisely. As the door closed behind him, Margaret sank into her chair and examined her hands. The same hands that had written impossible words, that bore no trace of deception or foreign ink. She thought of the birthmark hidden beneath her collar, the mark that had shaped her life's trajectory by making her unsuitable for marriage, but strangely qualified for work that required absolute reliability. The morning assembly proceeded without incident. Orders were distributed, reports filed, and the machinery of colonial administration continued its relentless function. But Margaret found herself studying each document she transcribed with new intensity, waiting for words that might appear without her conscious intent. 3 days passed without incident. On the fourth morning, as she transcribed routine supply requisitions, it happened again. Her pen seemed to move of its own accord, adding a single line to a request for medical supplies. The fever dreams show truth. Guard the southern wells. This time she was ready. She immediately examined the ink levels, the pen tip, the parchment itself. Everything appeared normal except for the impossible presence of words she had not intended to write. When Harwick arrived for their scheduled meeting, she presented him with the evidence. The southern wells, he mused, studying the document. There have been reports of illness in that district. Nothing serious, according to our local administrators. He looked up sharply. Miss Whitmore, I am beginning to suspect that your unique situation may be connected to something far older than either of us initially understood. What do you mean, sir? Instead of answering directly, Harwick moved to his private bookshelf and withdrew a slim volume bound in cracked leather. This is the personal journal of my predecessor, Governor Ashford. He served here for 15 years before suffering what the official reports termed a complete mental breakdown. His private writings, however, suggest a different explanation. Margaret accepted the journal with trembling hands. The pages fell open to an entry dated 3 months before Ashford's departure. The native woman continues to appear in my dreams, speaking in a language I do not understand but somehow comprehend. She warns of betrayed agreements, of prices that must still be paid. I have tried burning the documents she refers to, but they reappear in the files. The secretary claims no knowledge, but I suspect she lies. Or perhaps she tells the truth, which would be far worse. Sir, what happened to Governor Ashford's secretary? She disappeared the night before his official departure, never found, presumed dead. Harwick's voice was carefully neutral. However, certain records suggest she may have been special, marked in some way that made her sensitive to forces others could not perceive. Margaret's hand moved instinctively to her throat, to the birthmark hidden beneath her collar. Are you suggesting that I am suggesting nothing, Miss Whitmore. I am merely observing that unusual circumstances require unusual solutions. Tomorrow morning, I want you to transcribe a specific document, a formal inquiry into the historical treaties between the Crown and the local tribal leaders. If additional text appears, we will know our suspicions are correct. The weight of conspiracy settled upon Margaret's shoulders like a heavy cloak. She was being drawn into something that extended far beyond simple clerical error, something that connected her physical difference to the hidden history of the Protectorate itself. That evening, alone in her modest quarters above the bakery, Margaret examined herself in the mirror. The birthmark that covered her throat and traced upward along her left jaw had always seemed like cruel fate, the mark that prevented normal marriage and forced her into dependence upon work rather than family. Now she wondered if it might be something else entirely, some kind of sign or connection to forces she did not understand. She thought of Governor Ashford's secretary, a woman who had vanished rather than face whatever fate awaited those who became conduits for impossible messages. The smart choice would be to resign her position, to flee the Protectorate before she shared that predecessor's mysterious end. But Margaret had nowhere else to go. Her skills were valuable precisely because they were rare in the colonial territories. Her position with Harwick represented security and purpose that she could find nowhere else. More importantly, she was beginning to suspect that running would not save her from whatever force was using her hand to write messages from the past. The next morning arrived gray and humid, heavy with the promise of seasonal storms. Margaret prepared her workspace with extra care, arranging multiple inkwells and several different pens. If mysterious text was going to appear, she intended to document every detail of the process. Governor Harwick dictated the requested inquiry into historical treaties, his voice steady but his eyes watching her pen with unusual intensity. As Margaret wrote, she felt a strange tingling in her fingers, as if electricity was building beneath her skin. When she reached the formal conclusion of the document, her hand moved again without conscious direction. This time, the additional text was longer and more specific. The Treaty of 1807 was signed in blood by 3 chiefs and sealed with promises the Crown has broken. 7 sacred sites were protected by law, 5 have been violated. The debt grows with each transgression. Margaret Whitmore bears the mark of the witness. She will see what others cannot, write what others dare not. The choice approaches. Margaret set down her pen and stared at the impossible words. Her own name appeared in text she had not consciously written, connecting her directly to whatever force was communicating through her hand. "Sir," she whispered, "I think we may be in considerable danger." The Colonial Council chamber buzzed with tension as administrators filed in for the emergency session. Margaret sat at her designated desk beside the governor's chair, acutely aware that every eye in the room seemed to linger on her longer than necessary. Word of the mysterious additions to official documents had spread, despite Harwick's attempts at secrecy, and Chief Administrator Blackwood wore the satisfied expression of a man who sensed opportunity in another's misfortune. "Gentlemen," Governor Harwick began, his voice carrying across the mahogany-paneled room, We gather today to address concerns regarding the integrity of our official correspondence. Recent anomalies have been discovered, and we must ensure the Crown's business proceeds without compromise.
District Commissioner Walsh, a red-faced man whose years in the tropics had left him perpetually irritable, leaned forward in his chair. Governor, with respect, we all know what these anomalies are. Your secretary has been adding unauthorized text to colonial documents. The question is whether this represents incompetence or deliberate sabotage. Margaret felt her face flush, but she kept her eyes fixed on the blank parchment before her. The birthmark beneath her collar seemed to burn with shame and anger. She had transcribed Walsh's private correspondence often enough to know his own relationship with accuracy was flexible when it served his interests. Commissioner Walsh raises valid concerns, Blackwood interjected smoothly. However, I believe the matter requires more thorough investigation. Miss Whitmore, would you be so kind as to explain how text appears in your handwriting without your knowledge? The trap was expertly laid. To claim supernatural intervention would mark her as mad. To admit deliberate falsification would confirm their suspicions of sabotage. Margaret chose a third path, one that required considerable courage. Gentlemen, I propose a demonstration. Give me any document to transcribe while you observe directly. If unauthorized text appears, you will witness the phenomenon yourselves. The room fell silent. Several administrators exchanged glances, clearly unprepared for such directness. Governor Harwick's expression remained neutral, but Margaret caught a slight nod of approval. Very well, Walsh declared, producing a folded paper from his jacket. This is a routine supply request for my district. Transcribe it exactly as written, with no additions or modifications. Margaret accepted the document and began copying its contents. The familiar tingling sensation built in her fingers as she wrote, and she felt the room's collective attention like physical weight. When she reached the final line requesting additional medical supplies, her hand moved independently once again. The additional text materialized in her unmistakable script. Commissioner Walsh hides the true casualty counts. The fever spreads because the sacred springs have been poisoned. 12 natives dead, not 3 as reported. The ancestors demand justice. Walsh's face drained of color. This is preposterous. How could she possibly know? He stopped abruptly, realizing his words confirmed rather than denied the accuracy of the unauthorized information.
Know what, Commissioner? Harwick's voice was dangerously quiet. That you have misrepresented casualty figures in your district reports.
The room erupted in whispered conversations. Margaret realized she had inadvertently exposed actual corruption, lending credibility to her claims of involuntary writing. But Walsh's fury was now directed entirely at her, and she understood that making an enemy of a district commissioner would have serious consequences.
Governor Harwick, announced Dr.
Pemberton, the colony's chief medical officer, I received unofficial reports from native sources suggesting disease outbreaks in Walsh's district. If Miss Whitmore somehow has access to accurate information, perhaps we should investigate rather than condemn. Margaret felt a surge of unexpected gratitude toward the elderly doctor. She had transcribed enough of his correspondence to know he maintained better relationships with native healers than most colonial officials, despite regulations discouraging such contact.
This is absurd!
Walsh slammed his hand against the table. We're seriously considering that this woman receives mystical intelligence from native spirits. The explanation is far simpler. She's in contact with seditious elements and using her position to spread their propaganda. Commissioner Walsh, Harwick said with measured calm, you will submit revised casualty reports for your district by tomorrow morning. Dr. Pemberton will accompany an inspection team to verify the situation firsthand. He turned to address the full assembly. Until this matter is resolved, all official documents will be transcribed under direct supervision. Margaret understood the implications immediately. Her every action would be scrutinized, her unusual ability turned into a form of imprisonment. Worse, Walsh's accusation of seditious contact would follow her, making her position even more precarious. As the assembly dispersed, Blackwood approached her desk with predatory satisfaction. Miss Whitmore, I trust you understand that extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary precautions. You will be escorted to and from your quarters each day. Your correspondence will be monitored. Any unauthorized contact with local populations will be reported immediately.
I understand, sir.
Good. The governor may find your peculiar talents useful, but others of us remember that loyalty must be proven through service, not claimed through mysterious gifts. His smile was cold and calculating. Sleep well, Miss Whitmore. Your performance is being evaluated by authorities higher than colonial administration. That afternoon, Margaret found herself confined to the government house under the watchful eye of Sergeant Morrison, a career soldier whose weathered face revealed nothing of his thoughts. As she organized files in the archive room, she discovered something that chilled her blood. Hidden between routine correspondence from 1807 was a letter written in Governor Ashford's hand, but never sent. The date coincided with the mysterious treaty mentioned in her unauthorized writings. I cannot in good conscience continue this deception, the letter began. The agreements signed with the native chiefs were explicit. 7 sacred sites would remain untouched in perpetuity. The colonial office's directive to ignore these protections violates both legal contract and moral obligation. The consequences of such betrayal extend beyond politics into realms I dare not name in official correspondence. Margaret read further, her hands trembling as the full scope of the colonial administration's deception became clear. The profitable mining operations, the expanded agricultural settlements, the strategic military positions, all had been built on lands explicitly protected by treaty. The Crown's representatives had systematically violated legal agreements while reporting full compliance to London. Miss Whitmore, Sergeant Morrison's voice made her jump. Time to return to quarters. She folded the letter quickly, slipping it into her sleeve. The risk was enormous, but she needed to understand the full extent of what her mysterious ability was revealing. As Morrison escorted her through the evening streets, Margaret noticed unusual activity around the native quarter. Groups of colonial police moved with purpose, conducting searches and questioning residents.
What's happening, Sergeant?
Commissioner Walsh's orders, looking for seditious materials, native unrest organizers, the usual troublemakers. Morrison's tone suggested he found such operations routine, if not entirely pleasant.
Margaret's stomach nodded. Walsh was using her accusations of mystical communication to justify harassment of the local population. Her attempt to prove her innocence had provided excuse for exactly the kind of oppression the mysterious messages seemed to warn against.
In her small room above the bakery, Margaret lit a single candle and examined Ashford's hidden letter more carefully. The governor's private correspondence revealed a man torn between duty to the crown and recognition of moral wrong. His breakdown, she realized, might have been less about madness and more about the impossible position created by institutional betrayal. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Margaret quickly hid the letter and opened the door to find Sarah, the baker's daughter, holding a tray of bread and tea. "Compliments of Dr. Pemberton," Sarah whispered. "He asked me to tell you that some medicines work better when taken with local herbs. The old women know which ones."
Margaret accepted the tray, understanding the coded message. Pemberton was offering her contact with native healers, people who might understand her strange condition better than colonial authorities. But accepting such help would confirm Walsh's accusations of seditious contact.
"Please thank the doctor for his kindness," she replied carefully, "but tell him I must follow official protocols during this difficult time." Sarah nodded but pressed a small wrapped bundle into Margaret's hands. "From the old women anyway. They say the marked ones need protection when the ancestors speak." After Sarah left, Margaret unwrapped the bundle to find dried herbs and a small clay amulet carved with symbols she did not recognize. The clay felt warm against her palm, and the birthmark at her throat tingled strangely when she touched the amulet to her skin.
That night, Margaret dreamed of a woman standing beside a moonlit spring, her face bearing the same wine-dark birthmark that marked Margaret's throat. The woman spoke in a language Margaret did not understand, but somehow the meaning was clear. The treaty was written in blood and witnessed by the marked ones. Each generation must have its witness, or the balance fails. The choice approaches: serve the crown's lies or speak the ancestors' truth. Margaret woke with tears on her face and the taste of copper in her mouth. Outside her window, the first light of dawn revealed smoke rising from the native quarter. Walsh's searches had apparently escalated into something more serious. The next morning brought chaos to Government House. Dr. Pemberton arrived with grim news from his inspection of Walsh's district. The disease outbreak was far worse than reported, and evidence suggested contamination of water sources near mining operations. Meanwhile, reports flooded in of arrests and property destruction in the native quarter during overnight police actions. "Governor," Pemberton announced as Margaret transcribed his official report, "we face a crisis of credibility. The native population believes we deliberately poisoned their water sources. Whether or not this is factually accurate, the political consequences are severe." Harwick studied the reports spread across his desk, his expression growing darker with each revelation. "Commissioner Walsh will explain these discrepancies immediately. Miss Whitmore, prepare formal charges of filing false reports." As Margaret began writing the official accusations, her hand moved once again without conscious direction. The additional text was brief but devastating. "Walsh takes gold from the mining companies. The poisoned water serves their interests. 3 more will die today unless the springs are blessed according to Old Covenant." Harwick read the unauthorized edition and looked directly at Margaret. "Miss Whitmore, you will accompany Dr. Pemberton to the affected district today. If your unique insights prove accurate regarding today's casualties, we will discuss expanding your role in colonial intelligence." Margaret felt a chill of realization. The governor was not just tolerating her mysterious ability, he was beginning to rely upon it. The line between valued asset and dangerous tool was perilously thin, and she was walking directly along its edge. "Sir, Commissioner Walsh has made his position regarding my reliability quite clear. My presence in his district could complicate the situation." Commissioner Walsh's opinion is no longer relevant to this decision. Harwick's tone carried the finality of absolute authority. "You will observe, Miss Whitmore. You will transcribe exactly what you witness, and you will report any additional insights that emerge through your unusual channels." As Margaret prepared for the journey, she understood that her life was taking a dramatic turn. She was no longer simply a secretary who experienced strange episodes. She was becoming an intelligence asset whose mysterious gift might determine the fate of the entire protectorate. The ancestors, it seemed, had chosen their witness. Now she had to decide whether she was brave enough to fulfill that role. The journey to Walsh's district unfolded through landscape that seemed to mirror the growing tension between colonial authority and native resistance. Margaret rode in Dr. Pemberton's medical wagon, her eyes fixed on the distant mountains where smoke columns rose like accusatory fingers against the morning sky. The clay amulet hidden in her sleeve seemed to pulse with warmth as they approached the contested territory, and she found herself touching her throat, where the birthmark lay concealed beneath her high collar. "Miss Whitmore," Dr. Pemberton said quietly, his weathered hands steady on the reins. "What I'm about to show you must be recorded with absolute accuracy. The governor needs documentation that cannot be dismissed or altered by interested parties." He paused, studying her face. "I suspect your unusual condition may help us see patterns that others have missed." They crested a hill and Margaret gasped at the devastation below. What should have been fertile farmland was scarred with mining equipment, and the natural springs that had once provided clean water to 3 villages now ran dark with mineral contamination. Native families huddled in makeshift camps along the road, their belongings bundled in whatever cloth they could salvage. "The sacred springs," she whispered, remembering the phrase from her mysterious writings. "They've destroyed the sacred springs." Dr. Pemberton shot her a sharp look. "How did you know they were considered sacred?" That detail wasn't in any of the official reports. Margaret felt the familiar tingling in her fingers and knew that another episode was approaching.
She reached for her writing materials as they approached the first refugee camp, determined to document whatever information her strange gift might provide. Commissioner Walsh emerged from a military tent with the bearing of a man under siege. His uniform was rumpled, his face flushed with anger, and what Margaret suspected was fear. Behind him stood Captain Reynolds of the Colonial Guard, a young officer whose rigid posture suggested deep discomfort with his current assignment.
Dr. Pemberton, Walsh called out with forced joviality. Excellent timing. As you can see, we've relocated the affected populations to safe areas while we address the water contamination issues. His eyes fixed on Margaret with undisguised hostility. I was not informed that the governor's secretary would be joining this inspection.
Miss Whitmore is here to provide accurate documentation, Pemberton replied evenly. Given recent discrepancies in official reports, the governor requires independent verification of all findings.
Margaret began transcribing the conversation, but as her pen moved across the parchment,
additional words appeared in her familiar script. 17 dead, not 12. Hidden in the mining tunnels. Walsh fears the London inquiry more than native uprising. Captain Reynolds knows the true count. His conscience breaks under the weight of compliance. She looked up to find Captain Reynolds staring at her with an expression of startled recognition, as if her unauthorized text had somehow reached his eyes. The young officer's face had gone pale, and his hand trembled slightly as he saluted Dr. Pemberton.
Sir, if I may request private audience regarding casualty documentation, Reynolds began, his voice carefully controlled.
Walsh interrupted sharply. Captain Reynolds has all necessary information in his official reports. No private audiences are required. But Margaret noticed sweat beading on the commissioner's forehead despite the cool morning air. Dr. Pemberton moved toward the contaminated springs with professional purpose, collecting water samples and examining the mining equipment that had been hastily abandoned when the contamination was discovered. Margaret followed, her pen ready to record his findings, when she felt a strong hand grasp her arm.
Miss Whitmore. A native woman had appeared beside her with the silent grace that marked those who lived close to the land. Her face bore intricate tribal markings, and her eyes held the depth of accumulated wisdom. You carry the witness mark. The grandmothers have been waiting. Margaret glanced nervously at Commissioner Walsh, who was engaged in heated discussion with Dr. Pemberton about mining permits. I'm here in an official capacity. I cannot. The springs remember everything, the woman continued in accented English. They remember the treaty, the blood promise, the sacred boundaries. You will write what they remember, yes? The marked ones always write the truth.
Before Margaret could respond, the woman pressed something into her free hand. Another clay amulet, this one carved with symbols that seemed to shift and flow like water. The moment the clay touched her palm, Margaret's vision blurred and she found herself writing without conscious control. The text that flowed from her pen was unlike anything she had experienced before, not words in English, but symbols and diagrams that seemed to map the relationship between the contaminated springs and the broader network of sacred sites mentioned in the original treaty. As she drew, she somehow understood that the contamination was not accidental but deliberately designed to force native populations away from legally protected lands.
Miss Whitmore, Commissioner Walsh's voice cut through her trance. What exactly are you documenting there? Margaret looked down at her parchment in shock. The symbols she had drawn were accompanied by detailed technical specifications for mining equipment, financial records showing payments to Walsh from private mining interests, and a map marking the locations of undiscovered bodies hidden in the abandoned mine shafts.
She began, but Captain Reynolds stepped forward with sudden determination.
Sir, I must report discrepancies in the casualty counts. The official figures do not reflect the true scope of the situation. The young officer's voice carried the weight of moral conviction overcoming career concerns. There are bodies in the mining tunnels that have not been properly documented. Walsh's face flushed with rage. Captain Reynolds, you are out of order. These allegations are groundless and
Commissioner Walsh, Dr. Pemberton's quiet voice carried absolute authority. I am conducting this inspection under direct orders from Governor Harwick. Any interference with the collection of accurate information will be reported as obstruction of colonial administration. He moved to examine Margaret's mysterious documentation. Miss Whitmore, these diagrams appear to show mining operations that were not disclosed in the official permits.
Margaret realized she was at the center of a confrontation that would determine not just her own fate, but the entire colony's relationship with both the native population and the Crown's representatives in London. The information flowing through her mysterious gift was exposing a web of corruption that extended far beyond simple casualty reports.
"The grandmothers say the treaty must be honored," the native woman said softly, her words carrying to the entire group. "The marked witness has returned to speak the ancestors' truth. The balance must be restored, or the sickness spreads beyond these springs to all the colony." Commissioner Walsh drew his sidearm with shaking hands. "I will not stand here and listen to seditious nonsense from native agitators and hysterical secretaries. This inspection is concluded." The moment stretched taut with danger. Margaret understood that Walsh's desperation might drive him to violence against anyone who threatened to expose his corruption. But she also realized that her mysterious gift had provided exactly the evidence, Doctor. Pemberton needed to document the true scope of the crisis. Captain Reynolds placed his hand on his own weapon. "Commissioner Walsh, I respectfully suggest you reconsider your current course of action. Dr. Pemberton is conducting official colonial business under Governor Harwick's direct authority." "Official business?" Walsh laughed bitterly. "We're taking testimony from witch women and treating mysterious scribbling as intelligence reports. This entire inspection is a farce designed to undermine legitimate colonial authority." Margaret felt the clay amulet grow warm in her palm, and her hand began moving across the parchment once again. This time, the additional text was written in clear English that everyone present could read. The mine collapse was not accidental. Walsh ordered explosives to seal the evidence. 17 bodies buried. The sacred covenant requires justice for the dead, protection for the living, and restoration of the poisoned waters according to ancient law. Dr. Pemberton read the unauthorized text aloud, his voice carrying across the refugee camp. Native families began gathering, their faces showing a mixture of hope and desperate determination. Margaret realized that her mysterious writings had just accused a senior colonial official of murder and cover-up in front of witnesses from both communities. "This is treason," Walsh whispered, his weapon still trained on the small group around the contaminated spring. "I represent the Crown's authority in this district. These accusations are seditious lies designed to incite native uprising against legitimate government." "Commissioner Walsh," Dr. Pemberton said with deliberate calm, "you will surrender your weapon and submit to investigation. The evidence suggests serious crimes have been committed, and proper colonial justice requires thorough inquiry."
Margaret watched the standoff develop with growing terror. Her mysterious gift had exposed the truth, but truth in the colonial territories was often less important than maintaining stability. Walsh's desperation might lead him to eliminate witnesses rather than face London's justice.
The native woman stepped forward, her weathered hands raised in a gesture of ritual significance. "The springs speak through the marked one. The ancestors demand justice. If the Crown's law will not serve, the old law remains." Around the camp, Margaret noticed more native families approaching, many carrying traditional weapons alongside their meager possessions. The confrontation was escalating beyond colonial administration into something that might reshape the entire balance of power in the protectorate. Captain Reynolds made his choice with military precision. In a single swift movement, he disarmed Commissioner Walsh and secured the weapon. "Sir, you are under arrest pending investigation of the charges documented by Miss Whitmore and corroborated by evidence at this location." Walsh collapsed to his knees, his career and life destroyed by revelations that seemed to flow from sources beyond normal understanding. "You don't comprehend what you've done," he whispered. "The mining interests have agreements with authorities and above colonial administration. This investigation will destroy more than just my career." Margaret felt a chill of realization. Her mysterious gift had not just exposed local corruption, but had apparently uncovered a conspiracy that extended to the highest levels of imperial authority. The price of truth, she was beginning to understand, might be higher than anyone was prepared to pay. Dr. Pemberton began collecting physical evidence from the mining site, while Captain Reynolds organized the documentation of hidden casualties. But Margaret found herself drawn to the contaminated spring itself, where the water ran dark with industrial poison.
As she knelt beside the poisoned water, her hand moved once more across the parchment. The final message of the day was brief but ominous. The London partners will silence all witnesses. Margaret Whitmore has 3 days to choose, flee or stand with the treaty people. The ancestors cannot protect those who serve 2 masters. The emergency assembly convened at sunset with the weight of crisis pressing against Government House like a gathering storm. Margaret sat beside Governor Harwick's chair, her hands trembling as she arranged the documentation that would either establish her credibility or seal her fate. Chief Administrator Blackwood paced near the windows, his calculating gaze fixed on the native encampments that had sprung up around the colonial district since news of the contaminated springs had spread. "Gentlemen," Harwick began, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had made irreversible decisions, "we face circumstances that test the very foundation of colonial administration. The evidence collected by Dr. Pemberton confirms serious violations of both Crown law and treaty obligations. More troubling still are the implications of foreign commercial interference in territorial governance."
District Commissioner Morrison, recently arrived from the eastern provinces, leaned forward with obvious concern. "Governor, the reports from Miss Whitmore's unusual documentation suggest corruption extending to London itself. If these allegations prove accurate, we risk investigation by imperial authority rather than simple colonial review." Margaret felt the familiar tingling in her fingers as she prepared to transcribe the proceedings. The clay amulet hidden in her sleeve had grown warm since their return from Walsh's district, and she suspected another episode was approaching. The birthmark beneath her collar seemed to burn with anticipation of whatever message might emerge. "The question before us," Blackwood interjected smoothly, "is whether we trust intelligence gathered through supernatural means over established administrative channels. Miss Whitmore's claims are extraordinary, but the political consequences of acting upon them are severe." Governor Harwick studied the assembled administrators with the calculation of a career military officer evaluating tactical options. "Dr. Pemberton, present your findings regarding the mining operations and casualty figures." Dr. Pemberton rose with grim purpose. "The physical evidence confirms 17 deaths, not the 3 reported in official documents. The mining equipment was deliberately positioned to contaminate sacred springs protected under the original colonial treaty. Financial records recovered from Commissioner Walsh's quarters show payments from London-based mining syndicate totaling over £2,000 sterling over the past 18 months. The room erupted in whispered conversations. Margaret began transcribing the discussion, but as her pen moved across the parchment, additional text began flowing in her distinctive script. "The London partners arrive tomorrow on the merchant vessel Prosperity. They carry orders to eliminate all witnesses and transfer mining rights to Crown control. 3 colonial officials will be offered promotions to secure compliance. Governor Harwick's loyalty is questioned by imperial authority." She stared at the unauthorized words, understanding that her mysterious gift had just provided intelligence that could save lives or condemn them all as conspirators against the Crown. "Miss Whitmore," Harwick said quietly, noticing her distraction, "please share any additional insights that may have emerged." Margaret glanced around the room at faces that showed varying degrees of suspicion, curiosity, and calculation. Her next words would either establish her value as an intelligence asset or mark her for elimination as a security threat. "Sir, the information suggests that London representatives will arrive tomorrow with instructions that may compromise colonial stability. The mining interests appear to have influence at levels that extend beyond territorial administration." Blackwood moved closer to examine her transcription. "Governor, If Miss Whitmore's claims prove accurate, we face investigation not just of Walsh's corruption, but of our entire administrative structure. The political ramifications
are less important than justice, interrupted a new voice from the chamber entrance.
Captain Reynolds stood at attention, his uniform bearing the dust of hard travel. Behind him walked the native woman who had spoken to Margaret at the contaminated springs, her tribal markings stark in the lamplight.
Captain Reynolds, Harwick acknowledged, you were ordered to secure the mining site and await further instructions. Sir, circumstances have developed that require immediate attention. The native population has elected to invoke provisions of the original treaty that have never been formally rescinded. They request formal hearing under Crown law regarding treaty violations and demand restoration of sacred sites. The native woman stepped forward with dignity that commanded respect, despite the obvious hostility of several administrators. I am Ayana, speaker for the treaty clans. The marked witness has revealed what was hidden. We invoke ancient law that your queen's representatives signed in blood. Justice or uprising, the ancestors will accept no other choice. Margaret felt the weight of historical moments settling upon the room. Her mysterious gift had not just exposed corruption, but had apparently triggered legal processes that could reshape the entire relationship between colonial authority and indigenous rights.
Governor, Morrison whispered urgently, if they formally invoke treaty provisions, we must respond according to Crown law. Refusal could provide legal justification for armed resistance. Harwick studied Ayana with the respect of a military man, recognizing another leader prepared for warfare. What specific provisions do you invoke, and what evidence do you present to support claims of treaty violation?
Ayana produced a leather pouch and withdrew an ancient document written on parchment that seemed to glow with age.
The Covenant of 1807, signed by your predecessor and 3 clan chiefs. 7 sacred sites protected in perpetuity. Traditional water rights maintained. Native law recognized in matters concerning sacred places. Margaret's hand moved across her transcription page without conscious direction. The additional text that emerged was written in symbols that somehow conveyed meaning despite her inability to read them consciously. The blood covenant requires balance. 17 deaths demand 17 years of protection. The mining gold carries curse until justice restores the sacred waters. Margaret Whitmore must choose her master, the crown that profits from betrayal, or the ancestors who demand truth. Dr. Pemberton examined the ancient treaty document with scholarly interest. Governor, this appears to be authentic. The signatures match those in our colonial archives, and the legal language is consistent with Crown treaty practices of that period. However, Blackwood interjected with calculated precision, invoking dormant treaty provisions during a period of colonial crisis could be interpreted as seditious conspiracy. London authorities may view formal recognition of native legal claims as weakness rather than justice.
Margaret realized she was witnessing the moment when personal conscience would clash with institutional loyalty. The mysterious force that spoke through her pen was demanding that colonial officials choose between career advancement and moral obligation.
Harwick moved to the window and gazed out at the native encampments where cooking fires created pools of warm light in the gathering darkness. Miss Whitmore transcribed the following official statement. By order of Governor Edmund Harwick, all mining operations in districts containing sacred sites protected under the Treaty of 1807 are hereby suspended pending formal legal review. Traditional water rights will be restored according to original covenant provisions. The room fell silent as the full implications of his declaration became clear. Margaret wrote the governor's words, but her hand continued moving to add unauthorized text. London will demand Harwick's removal within 72 hours. The merchant vessel carries replacement administrators and military enforcement. The treaty clans prepare for war if justice fails. Margaret Whitmore holds the key to alliance or destruction. Blackwood's face had gone pale with realization. Governor, you are exceeding your authority. These decisions require approval from Territorial Command and Colonial Office Review. The consequences
are mine to bear, Harwick finished quietly. Captain Reynolds, you will escort Miss Whitmore and Ayanna to secure quarters within Government House. They are under official protection pending resolution of this matter.
As the assembly dispersed, Margaret found herself walking beside Ayanna through the corridors of colonial power. The native woman's presence seemed to make the building itself feel different, as if ancient forces were awakening after long slumber. "The spirits speak truly through you," Ayanna said softly, "but truth is dangerous to those who profit from lies. The marked ones must choose their path carefully." "What happened to Governor Ashford's secretary? The woman who disappeared?" Ayanna's weathered face showed deep sadness. "She chose the ancestors over the crown. They gave her new life with the treaty people, but she could never return to the white world. Such choices cannot be undone."
Margaret touched the clay amulet hidden in her sleeve, feeling its warmth pulse like a heartbeat. "The messages that come through my pen, are they from spirits or from some other source? Does the source matter when the truth serves justice?"
Ayanna paused at the entrance to the guest quarters. "Tomorrow, when the London ships arrive, you must decide whether you serve the crown that denies its promises or the ancestors who remember every betrayal. The marked witness cannot serve two masters." That night, Margaret lay awake listening to the sounds of preparation drifting from the native camps. Drums beat in rhythms that seemed to echo the pulse of the clay amulet, and occasionally she heard voices raised in what sounded like war songs. Through her window, she could see the lights of ships anchored in the harbor, waiting for dawn to bring whatever forces London had dispatched to resolve the colonial crisis.
Near midnight, a soft knock at her door interrupted her restless thoughts. She opened it to find Governor Harwick, his uniform replaced by simple traveling clothes. "Miss Whitmore, walk with me." His voice carried the weight of a man who had made decisions that could not be reversed. They moved through the darkened corridors to his private study, where maps and documents covered every surface. The locked cabinet containing the original colonial charters stood open, its contents spread across his desk.
"I have spent the evening reviewing every treaty, every agreement, every promise made by Crown representatives to the native population over the past 50 years, Harwick said quietly. "The pattern of betrayal is systematic and deliberate. Walsh was merely one tool in a larger design to seize protected lands for commercial exploitation."
Margaret studied the evidence spread before them: forged documents, falsified reports, and communications revealing the scope of the conspiracy between colonial administrators and London commercial interests. "Sir, what will you do when the London representatives arrive?" Harwick moved to his window and gazed out at the harbor where ships waited like sleeping predators.
"I will honor my oath to serve Crown justice rather than Crown profit. The consequences for my career are irrelevant compared to the moral obligation created by these revelations."
Margaret felt her hand move to her writing materials without conscious thought. As her pen touched parchment, words flowed in her mysterious script. "Governor Edmund Harwick will face charges of exceeding authority and inciting native rebellion. The replacement administrator carries orders for military suppression of treaty claims. Margaret Whitmore must
testify before Imperial authority or face elimination as security threat. The choice approaches: speak truth to power or become another's disappeared witness." Harwick read the unauthorized text with the calm of a man who had already calculated the probable cost of his decisions. "Miss Whitmore, tomorrow morning you will have the opportunity to present your unusual gifts to authorities who possess power to either validate your claims or destroy everyone connected to them. Are you prepared for that responsibility?" Margaret thought of Ayanna's words about serving two masters, of the previous secretary who had vanished rather than face such a choice, of the 17 dead whose voices seemed to speak through her pen demanding justice.
"Governor, I believe I must serve truth rather than convenience, regardless of the consequences."
"Then God help us both," Harwick said quietly, "because tomorrow we discover whether the Crown's justice extends to protecting those who expose the Crown's crimes."
The morning sun cast sharp shadows across Government House as 3 ships from London disgorged their passengers onto the colonial docks.
Margaret stood at the window of Governor Harwick's office, watching Imperial authority representatives march up from the harbor with military precision. Their leader, a tall man in the distinctive blue uniform of the Colonial Investigation Service, carried himself with the bearing of one accustomed to absolute power over distant territories.
"Inspector General Mortimer," Governor Harwick announced grimly, reading from the official communication that had arrived with the dawn. 28 years in colonial service, specializing in what London terms administrative irregularities. His record includes the suppression of 3 native uprisings and the restructuring of 7 colonial governments.
Margaret arranged her transcription materials with trembling hands. The clay amulet hidden in her sleeve had grown cold as ice since the ship's arrival, and the birthmark beneath her collar ached with a pain that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. She understood that the coming confrontation would determine not just her personal fate, but the future relationship between colonial authority and indigenous rights throughout the empire. "Miss Whitmore," Harwick said quietly, "Inspector General Mortimer will demand a demonstration of your unusual abilities. You must decide whether to reveal the full extent of your gift or maintain the pretense that your writings result from conventional intelligence gathering." Before Margaret could respond, the office doors burst open without ceremony. Inspector General Mortimer entered with 4 armed escorts, his pale eyes surveying the room with the methodical assessment of a predator evaluating potential threats. Behind him walked Chief Administrator Blackwood, whose satisfied expression revealed where his ultimate loyalties resided. "Governor Harwick," Mortimer began without preamble, his voice carrying the crisp authority of Imperial command. "You stand accused of exceeding administrative authority, inciting native rebellion, and conspiring with seditious elements to undermine Crown commercial interests. These are serious charges that require immediate investigation." Margaret began transcribing the confrontation, but as her pen moved across the parchment, additional text began flowing in her distinctive script. "Mortimer carries sealed orders for military suppression. Harwick to be arrested within the hour, native leaders targeted for elimination, Margaret Whitmore designated as security risk, permanent silence required." She stared at the unauthorized words, realizing that her mysterious gift was providing intelligence about planned violence against everyone who had supported the treaty claims. The choice Ayanna had spoken of was no longer theoretical. Within hours, she might face death for possessing knowledge too dangerous for Imperial authority to permit. "Inspector General," Harwick replied with military composure, "I have acted within my authority to investigate treaty violations and administrative corruption. The evidence supports immediate action to prevent further legal violations." Mortimer moved to examine the documents spread across Harwick's desk, his trained eyes assessing the scope of evidence that had been gathered. "Governor, these so-called treaty violations concern commercial development of unused territorial lands. The original agreements were negotiated under circumstances that no longer apply to modern colonial requirements." Margaret felt the familiar tingling in her fingers as her hand moved independently across the parchment. The additional text that emerged was longer and more specific than any previous episode. "The London Syndicate has purchased Imperial Authority cooperation. Mortimer owns shares in 3 mining operations. The Queen's representatives have been bought by the same commercial interests they pretend to investigate. Justice requires witnesses willing to die for truth." Inspector General Mortimer's attention fixed on Margaret's transcription with the intensity of a man recognizing immediate danger. "Miss Whitmore, you will surrender those documents for official review. Unauthorized additions to formal proceedings constitute seditious activity under Colonial Administration Code." Margaret understood that handing over her transcriptions would provide Mortimer with evidence of her mysterious abilities while simultaneously eliminating the documentary proof of his corruption. The moment had arrived when she must choose between self-preservation and moral obligation. "Inspector General, these documents represent official colonial business conducted under Governor Harwick's direct authority. I am not authorized to surrender them without proper legal process." Mortimer's face flushed with anger at her defiance. Miss Whitmore, you are addressing Imperial authority, not colonial administration. Your cooperation is not requested, it is commanded. Governor Harwick stepped between Mortimer and Margaret with protective instinct. Inspector General, Miss Whitmore is under official colonial protection pending investigation of her unique intelligence capabilities. Any interference with that protection will be reported to London as obstruction of territorial security operations. The confrontation escalated as Mortimer realized that his authority was being directly challenged by colonial officials who possessed evidence of Imperial corruption. Margaret watched the Inspector General's hand move toward his weapon, understanding that violence was becoming more likely with each exchange. Governor Harwick, Mortimer said with deadly calm, you are under arrest for exceeding administrative authority and conspiring with native seditionists. Miss Whitmore will be detained pending investigation of her involvement in spreading false intelligence designed to incite colonial rebellion. Before anyone could react, the office doors opened once again to admit Ayanna and 3 other native leaders, their presence transforming the political confrontation into something with deeper historical significance. The tribal spokeswoman carried the ancient treaty document, her weathered hands holding it with reverence for the promises it contained. Inspector General Mortimer, Ayanna announced with quiet dignity, the treaty clans invoke ancient law. The blood covenant signed by your queen's representatives requires justice for violations of sacred agreements. We demand formal hearing under Crown law. Mortimer stared at the native leaders with undisguised contempt. This is colonial territory under Imperial administration. Native populations have no legal standing to make demands of Crown representatives. Margaret's hand moved across her parchment without conscious direction, and the words that emerged were written in the strange symbols that had appeared before. The ancient law predates Imperial authority. Treaties signed in blood carry power beyond political convenience. Mortimer fears what he cannot understand. Justice that serves truth rather than profit.
Ayanna read the unauthorized text over Margaret's shoulder, her face showing deep recognition. The marked witness speaks the ancestors' truth. The blood covenant binds all who signed, including the Crown's representatives, who inherited their promises.
Inspector General Mortimer drew his weapon with military precision. This gathering is now declared seditious conspiracy against Imperial authority. All participants are under arrest pending transfer to London for trial. The moment stretched taut with the potential for violence that could reshape the entire colonial relationship. Margaret realized that her mysterious gift had brought them to a crisis point where truth and power would clash with potentially deadly consequences. Captain Reynolds appeared in the doorway with a squad of colonial soldiers, their weapons ready but their loyalty clearly divided between Imperial commands and colonial justice. Inspector General, sir, what are your orders regarding the disposition of the prisoners?
Margaret felt the clay amulet grow warm in her sleeve as her hand moved once more across the parchment.
The final message was brief but carried the weight of historical inevitability. Choose this moment. Serve the Crown's lies or die for the ancestors' truth. No middle path remains. Margaret Whitmore's decision determines whether justice lives or dies in this colony. She looked around the room at faces that showed fear, determination, anger, and calculation. Governor Harwick awaited arrest for honoring his moral obligations. Ayanna and her people faced elimination for demanding justice under laws their ancestors had negotiated in good faith. Inspector General Mortimer represented imperial power corrupted by commercial interests that profited from systematic betrayal. Margaret stood, her transcription materials in hand, and faced Inspector General Mortimer with courage born of moral clarity. Sir, I formally request that these proceedings be recorded for transmission to Her Majesty's government. The evidence of treaty violations and administrative corruption requires review by authorities higher than colonial or imperial administration.
Mortimer's weapon remained trained on her, but his expression showed uncertainty. Margaret had just invoked the highest level of imperial review, a process that could expose everyone involved to scrutiny from the Crown itself.
Miss Whitmore, he said quietly, You are requesting investigation that could destroy careers and alter colonial policy throughout the empire. Are you prepared for the consequences of such a request?
Margaret thought of the 17 dead buried in mining tunnels, of the poisoned sacred springs, of the systematic betrayal of legal agreements signed by Crown representatives. She thought of Governor Ashford's secretary, who had disappeared rather than face such a choice, and of Ayana's words about serving two masters. Inspector General, I am prepared to serve truth rather than convenience, regardless of the personal consequences. The evidence speaks for itself, and justice requires that it be heard by those with authority to act upon it. The room fell silent as everyone present understood that Margaret had just committed herself to a path that would either vindicate the treaty claims or result in her elimination as a security threat. Her mysterious gift had brought them to this moment of choice, and now she must face whatever consequences emerged from speaking truth to Imperial power.
Inspector General Mortimer holstered his weapon with visible reluctance. Very well, Miss Whitmore. We shall test the reliability of your unusual intelligence capabilities under conditions that will determine whether you represent valuable Imperial asset or dangerous security risk.
Margaret understood that she had gained a temporary reprieve, but the price would be demonstrating her mysterious
abilities under circumstances designed to either validate her claims or provide justification for her permanent silence. The ancestors had chosen their witness, and now she must prove worthy of that terrible honor. The formal hearing convened in the Grand Assembly Hall with representatives from London, colonial administration, and the treaty clans arranged in careful configuration that acknowledged the historical significance of the proceedings. Margaret sat at a witness table facing Inspector General Mortimer, her transcription materials arranged with military precision. The birthmark beneath her collar throbbed with intensity that seemed to pulse in harmony with the ancient treaty document displayed on the central podium.
Miss Margaret Whitmore, announced Lord Justice Pemberton, the senior Imperial representative who had arrived on the final ship from London, you stand before this tribunal to demonstrate the intelligence capabilities that have been reported through irregular channels. The Crown requires verification of your claims before determining the validity of accusations made against colonial and imperial administration.
Margaret arranged her pen and parchment with hands that trembled despite her determination to appear composed. Around the hall, she could see faces that represented every faction involved in the crisis. Governor Harwick under armed guard, Ayana and the native leaders maintaining dignified silence, Inspector General Mortimer, whose career depended upon discrediting her testimony, and Chief Administrator Blackwood, whose calculating gaze suggested he was preparing to align himself with whichever side demonstrated greater power.
Your Lordship, Margaret began, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled representatives, I respectfully request that any information that emerges through my unusual condition be recorded exactly as it appears, without interpretation or modification by administrative personnel. Lord Justice Pemberton studied her with the sharp attention of a man accustomed to evaluating evidence under pressure. Miss Whitmore, you may proceed with your demonstration. However, be advised that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The implications of your alleged abilities extend far beyond this colonial dispute.
Margaret dipped her pen and began transcribing the formal opening of the hearing, but within moments she felt the familiar sensation of her hand moving independently. The additional text that emerged was unlike any previous episode, longer, more detailed, and written with urgent intensity. Lord Justice Pemberton carries secret instructions to validate Imperial commercial interests, regardless of evidence. The London Syndicate has purchased investigation outcomes through political influence extending to parliamentary levels. However, Queen Victoria's personal secretary has received independent reports of colonial treaty violations. Her Majesty demands justice under Crown law, not commercial convenience. The witness mark connects Margaret Whitmore to covenant powers that predate imperial authority. Truth will be spoken regardless of political consequences. The unauthorized text filled nearly half the parchment, its implications sending shockwaves through the assembled representatives. Lord Justice Pemberton's face showed surprise that appeared genuine, suggesting that Margaret's mysterious gift had revealed information unknown even to senior Imperial authority.
Miss Whitmore, Lord Justice Pemberton said carefully,
these are serious accusations regarding the integrity of Imperial investigation processes. Do you maintain that this text appeared without your conscious knowledge or intent?
Your Lordship, I swear upon my honor that I wrote only the official transcription. The additional text emerged through the same mysterious process that has been documented throughout this colonial crisis.
Inspector General Mortimer rose with visible agitation. Lord Justice Pemberton, we are being asked to accept supernatural intelligence as evidence in matters of Imperial security. This proceeding has devolved into primitive superstition rather than proper legal investigation. Ayanna stood from her place among the treaty representatives, her tribal markings stark in the formal lighting. Lord Justice Pemberton, the marked witness speaks with voices that your Queen's ancestors recognized in the Blood Covenant. Ancient law requires that such testimony be heard when sacred agreements face violation.
Margaret felt her hand move across the parchment once again, and the symbols that emerged were the same flowing script that had appeared at the contaminated springs. But this time she found herself speaking the meaning aloud as she wrote. The Treaty of 1807 was witnessed by powers that endure beyond political change. 17 sacred sites were protected by covenants signed in blood and sealed with promises that bind the crown in perpetuity. 5 sites have been violated through commercial conspiracy that corrupts imperial justice. The debt of betrayal grows with each broken promise. Margaret Whitmore bears the witness mark that connects mortal justice to eternal law. Choose this moment, honor the covenant, or face consequences that extend beyond colonial rebellion to spiritual judgment. The hall fell silent as the full implications of her words became clear. Margaret had just claimed that her mysterious abilities represented connection to forces that predated and superseded imperial authority itself. Lord Justice Pemberton examined the ancient treaty document with scholarly attention, comparing its provisions to the evidence that had been gathered regarding mining operations and treaty violations. Miss Whitmore, if your claims are accurate, this tribunal faces decisions that could reshape colonial policy throughout the empire. Margaret's hand continued moving across fresh parchment, and the text that emerged carried urgent immediacy. 3 native uprisings planned for tomorrow dawn, unless justice is demonstrated today. The treaty clans have prepared for war as alternative to continued betrayal. Governor Harwick's arrest will trigger coordinated resistance across 7 colonial territories. London commercial interests have corrupted imperial justice to the point where armed rebellion appears more reliable than legal process.
Inspector General Mortimer's face had gone pale as he realized the strategic implications of the intelligence Margaret was providing. Lord Justice Pemberton, if this information proves accurate, we face colonial crisis that could threaten imperial stability across multiple territories.
However, Lord Justice Pemberton replied thoughtfully,
Miss Whitmore's intelligence also provides opportunity to address grievances through legal justice rather than military suppression. The question becomes whether imperial authority serves crown law or commercial interest.
Margaret felt the clay amulet grow warm in her sleeve as her hand moved once more across the parchment.
The final message was brief but carried the weight of historical turning point. Queen Victoria's personal investigation has begun. Imperial representatives who choose justice over corruption will be protected. Those who serve commercial conspiracy over crown law will face royal displeasure. Margaret Whitmore's testimony determines whether this colony demonstrates imperial justice or imperial failure.
Lord Justice Pemberton read the unauthorized text with growing seriousness, then addressed the full assembly with formal authority. Based upon the evidence presented and the intelligence provided through Miss Whitmore's extraordinary capabilities, this tribunal makes the following determinations. The Treaty of 1807 remains legally binding upon Crown representatives.
Commercial operations violating protected sacred sites are hereby terminated pending full legal review. All administrative officials involved in falsifying casualty reports or accepting unauthorized commercial payments will face formal charges under Imperial law. Inspector General Mortimer attempted to protest, but Lord Justice Pemberton continued with finality that brooked no opposition. Furthermore, Miss Margaret Whitmore is hereby recognized as official intelligence asset to Imperial authority, with protection extended to her unique capabilities and the communities that support her work.
Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as she understood that her terrible gift had somehow achieved the impossible, imperial justice for systematic colonial betrayal. But her hand moved once more across the parchment, and the final message carried both victory and warning. Justice begins today, but the work continues. The witness mark passes to each generation that faces choice between truth and convenience. Margaret Whitmore has chosen truth. Others must now choose whether to honor that choice or face the consequences of betrayal. Governor Harwick was released from custody and reinstated with commendation for his moral courage in exposing colonial corruption. The native leaders were granted formal recognition of their treaty rights, with sacred sites protected under imperial guarantee. Inspector General Mortimer faced investigation for commercial conspiracy, while Chief Administrator Blackwood found his career prospects considerably diminished by his association with discredited policies. 6 months later, Margaret stood beside the restored sacred springs, watching native children play in water that ran clear and clean once more. The birthmark that had marked her as different now connected her to a network of imperial intelligence gathering that extended across multiple colonies. Her mysterious gift had found purpose in service of crown justice rather than commercial conspiracy. Ayanna approached with the slow dignity of advanced age, her weathered face showing deep satisfaction at the restoration of her people's rights. The marked witness has chosen well. The ancestors are pleased with the balance that has been restored. Margaret touched the clay amulet that she now wore openly as symbol of her unique role in imperial service. What happens to others like me? Are there more who carry the witness mark? In every generation, in every place where ancient agreements face modern betrayal, the marked ones appear to speak truth that others cannot see. You have shown that such gifts can serve justice rather than suffer persecution. Margaret thought of her transcription work, now expanded to include intelligence gathering for imperial investigations across multiple territories. Her mysterious abilities had transformed from curse into calling, connecting her to purposes larger than individual survival. The choice continues, she said quietly, watching the sun set over land where sacred law and imperial justice had found common ground. Each day brings new decisions about whether to serve truth or convenience, justice or profit. Ayanna nodded with the wisdom of accumulated years. The witness mark never fades, Margaret Whitmore, but now others will see it as sign of service rather than symbol of difference. The ancestors have accepted your choice, and the crown has learned to value truth over commercial convenience. As darkness settled over the restored springs, Margaret understood that her journey from isolated secretary to imperial intelligence asset represented more than personal transformation. The systematic exposure of colonial corruption had demonstrated that imperial justice could serve moral law when witnesses possessed courage to speak truth regardless of consequences. The mysterious force that spoke through her pen had guided her through crisis to purpose, from persecution to protection, from isolation to connection with powers that transcended political authority. The witness mark would continue to appear in each generation that faced choice between truth and betrayal, ensuring that ancient promises received modern protection. Margaret Whitmore had chosen to serve the ancestors' truth rather than the crown's convenience, and in doing so had discovered that true imperial authority required moral courage rather than commercial corruption. The balance had been restored, but vigilance would be required to maintain it. The choice would always remain: serve truth or suffer the consequences of betrayal.
But now Margaret knew she would not face that choice alone.